A common question of women when it comes to their pelvic floor health is, how do I know if I'm doing my pelvic floor contraction correctly? My name is Krista Dennett, pelvic floor exercise specialist. In this video, I'm going to show you some tips on how you can self-assess for your own pelvic floor contraction. Hey, and if you haven't done so already, don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you can stay up to date on my latest videos related to pelvic floor health and exercise and movement, as well as general women's health information in the field of exercise. A question on many women's minds are, how do they know if they're doing a kegel correctly? Well, I'm here to help you answer that question. Tip number one for setting yourself up for an ideal pelvic floor contraction is to check in with your alignment or posture and your breathing. So if you haven't already done so, make sure you watch my video on posture and my video on breathing. In most of my videos, I talk about that inner canister, inner core team of muscles, the top being the diaphragm and the bottom being the pelvic floor. So those two connections are why we need breath in order for us to feel for that pelvic floor contraction. As you inhale, the diaphragm draws down into the abdominal cavity. The pelvic floor is meant to relax or lengthen. And as you exhale, the pelvic floor is meant to contract as the diaphragm returns back to its starting position. The other thing you need to know is that there are layers of your pelvic floor muscle, and it is a bowl shape. So I'll show you here. There's a bowl shape in the bottom of your pelvis, a bowl shape of your muscles in the bottom of your pelvis. And there are layers. We call it the superficial layer and the deep layer of muscles. You may be flickering that pelvic floor contraction, but only hitting the superficial layer. We want to make sure that you get that deep layer and contraction. Now, of course, the most definitive way you're going to know if you're doing your pelvic floor contraction correctly is to see a pelvic floor physical therapist or a women's health physical therapist. They're specifically trained to do an internal exam to assess the function of your pelvic floor and inner core team. When they are looking at pelvic floor contraction, what they're looking for is strength, endurance, agility, and the ability of those muscles to relax. When we talk about strength, that is, are you getting into all the layers of the muscle when you're contracting? Or is it just staying at the surface or the superficial layer? Endurance is, can you hold that contraction for up to 10 seconds? Agility is, can you turn that muscle on and off really quickly? That comes into play when you're doing things like jumping or running. And finally, can you lengthen or relax the muscle? If you can't, then it's known as hypertonicity. Another way that you can determine if you are doing a pelvic floor contraction is to get a biofeedback device. Two of the biofeedback devices that I recommend is PeriFit, that is a company out of France, and Joyon, that's a company out of the United States. I'm going to do a video later on about these two products specifically, but what these do is they allow you to connect to your phone with an app, and then when you're doing your pelvic floor contraction, you can see how well that contraction is working, or if you are able to get any feedback from doing that contraction. Now let's get on to looking at how you can self-assess for your own pelvic floor contraction. Well, of course, one way you can do is to insert fingers into the vagina, and then you can feel for a tightening of your muscles around your fingers as you're doing a pelvic floor contraction. Now, I know that's not the most exciting thing for everybody to do, but if you are comfortable with it, that is one way to know if you're getting that contraction and lift. So you want to feel, are you able to tighten around your fingers and feel a lifting sensation of your fingers? So that's one way of figuring out if you're doing a pelvic floor contraction. All right, let's look at another way you can work on practicing your pelvic floor contractions and feeling for if you're doing them correctly or you're actually creating some muscle movement when you're doing your contraction. I'm going to break this down into breath and then break down the cues on how we want to connect to our pelvic floor. We're going to think about some visualization cues because the mind over matter is very integral in believing that these muscles are doing what they're supposed to do. One thing I want you to start to believe is that These muscles are born to work the way that we are asking them to work right now. Lifestyle, sedentary lifestyle, pregnancy, injury, many things can get in the way and compromise the natural flow of those muscles and the natural flow of our breath. So we need to remind our body that it can go back to the way that it was born to operate. So keep that in mind. What we're asking of it is not foreign, but actually the way it's meant to work. The other thing is we need to think about our breathing. And I want you to think about breathing in through your nose. And if that's a challenge, you can still breathe in through your mouth and then slowly exhale through your mouth. The reason we want to do a slow exhale is so we can give ourselves some time to feel for the connection of the muscle. If we're blowing out too forcefully, it's very difficult to feel for that pelvic floor contraction. And then the other visualization cue we're going to work on is thinking about ways to connect to that pelvic floor. Let's start with lying on the back. It is easiest for most people to learn how to contract your pelvic floor when we take out gravity. So gravity is out of play when we're lying down on our back. Knees can be bent and feet flat on the ground. You want to make sure you have a neutral pelvis, so you're not trying to press your low back into the mat or you're trying to hyperextend your back. So find that comfortable midline position for the pelvis. So we think about lining up our domes, the dome at the pelvis, dome at the diaphragm, dome at the top. Once we have that alignment, then you want to think about your breathing. And if you haven't watched my breathing and alignment videos, I strongly recommend you do, because our alignment and breath is an integral part of retraining this inner core how we want it to work. Okay, so from here, I'm going to think about breathing in to my ribs, and the ribs are opening up into the floor, but you shouldn't see any movement in my body. So as I'm breathing in, you don't want to see me trying to forcefully aim my ribs to the floor. It's just opening up. I have my hands up so you can see what's going on. You're simply inhaling, thinking about ribs into the back, into the floor. And then exhale, I talk about maintaining length up your sides. So we're setting up an environment for the natural function of that inner core. That inner core does work in our subconscious as well to anticipate movement and maintain our stability. So what we're doing here with our alignment and our breath is we're setting the environment for it to have a better chance of working, okay? So from here, I want you to think about breathing into your back. Abdominals are soft as you inhale, so you're not inflating up your belly, and then exhale, maintaining your length. So once you feel comfortable doing that, then let's talk about how are we going to connect our pelvic floor and coordinate it with our breathing. Remember, as you breathe in, the diaphragm drops down and we want the pelvic floor to lengthen and relax. As you exhale, the pelvic floor contracts and the diaphragm returns back to its original spot. So as you exhale is when we're going to think about voluntarily contracting that pelvic floor. How do we do that? Well, you can think kegel. You can think about maybe stopping the flow of urine. But the one area that gets missed often is a balance between connecting to all parts of our pelvic floor. So as I showed you in my model, there is, it's a bowl shape. So we want to make sure that we're contracting back and front, not just feeling it in mostly the vaginal area. So a cue I use most often, that seems to be the more popular one, is to think about picking up a blueberry with your anus and vagina and lifting them in, and you're not going to squish them. So you're not going to clench your butt cheeks. It's just a simple sensation of anus, vagina lifting up on your exhale. I'll move my arms out of the way. You can watch my stomach do this. All you'll see is my stomach moving with breath. I'm going to take a breath in here, and then I'm going to think blueberries. All right, so that is step one. Some other cues at work is thinking about jellyfish. So as you exhale, it's like the jellyfish is rising up. Other times we think about elevator going up, sipping a milkshake through a straw. Many different cues you could use to feel or visualize the thought of lifting the pelvic floor. Now, the transverse abdominals, which wrap around you like a corset, and they form part of that inner canister, your inner core muscles, they co-contract with your pelvic floor. You can actually feel for your transverse abdominals. Now, I will say on the side here, if they are atrophied or on the weaker side, it may be more difficult to feel for any kind of tension of the transverse abdominals. Maybe you have a little bit of excess, we call it adipose tissue, so you might want to push your fingers in quite firm so that you can feel for any kind of flicker or movement of those muscles underneath your fingertips. So you're going to find your wingtips of your pelvis, walk your fingers in about an inch or so, and maybe down just an inch or so, so they're in sort of your pubic zone, all right? And then from there, you're going to do your breath. So think about inhale and into the floor, abdominals relax. Exhale, think about picking up the blueberries and see if you can feel anything. Now, something I want to reiterate here is that this is not doing a bicep curl type contraction. This is a very soft contraction. So like I said before, you may not feel much, or you may feel the hint of a flicker, but there is a chance that the transverses may not be working and may not be firing. So this is where you really need to think about your visualization cue. We're not asking your body to do something it doesn't know how to do. We're reminding it to do something it was born to do. So the cue I use to visually think about contracting your transverse abdominals in addition to your pelvic floor is to imagine you're trying to bring your hip bones or even your fingertips together just a millimeter, like you're trying to pull them together. So if you watch carefully, you will see no movement in my pelvis. Everything I'm doing, I'm feeling it under my fingertips. I'm feeling my pelvic floor lifting up. So I'm going to take my breath in. I'm going to exhale, pick up the blueberries, and bring my fingertips together slightly. Now, if you're finding you're not feeling anything, you may find that you're going to do what we call bearing down. Bearing down looks like this. On my exhale, I'm trying so hard to feel for something that I'm tilting my body. And a lot of sort of tension you'll see around the upper part of my ribs. My pelvis will start to move. And that tells me that we're not actually getting that nice inner lift and connection of that inner core, but actually we're bearing down and creating inter-abdominal pressure in an effort to try to contract that pelvic floor. So it looks like this. If I'm going to try too hard, I'm going to take a breath in, I'm going to exhale, and I'm going to think, trying to bring that pelvic floor up. And you see there's a lot of movement and tension in my body. We want to avoid doing that. Other than seeing your abdominals moving for breath, I shouldn't see much going on the surface. If you find that is the case, one of the things that I do with clients is I say, okay, let's think about, you can pick up those blueberries, or maybe it's an elevator. Let's go 50% effort, okay? So if you're finding you're like, oh, I'm trying to pick up those blueberries, hands normally would be at your side, but try to pick up the blueberries, I'm like, okay, let's go 50% effort. Let's try to flicker and get the movement of those muscles without bearing down. So that's another way to correct if you may be doing a Kegel or pelvic floor contraction and bearing down. Okay, let's recap these cues. We're going to think about picking up blueberries back and front. We're going to lift them in, and we're going to pull our fingertips together. So back, front, in, together is what we're thinking about on our exhale. Using your fingertips to feel for a connection. Take a breath in. And then back, front, in, together. Other than my breathing in my abdominal area, maybe feeling a little bit of tension under my fingertips, you shouldn't see too much going on. Now, in some cases, lying down and trying to contract your pelvic floor may actually be a challenge. So another way that you can work on feeling for a connection to your pelvic floor with your breath is to sit down. Ideally, if you're on a stability ball, that's great, because we can visualize the rounding of the ball against our perineum. The perineum is the space between the vagina and anus. So from here, you want to lean forward and careful not to round through your back. Your alignment of your domes is just as important in this position as it is in any other position when we're working on coordinating our breath and pelvic floor contraction. Use the same visualization cues, especially in this position. It may feel easier to contract at the front or the vaginal area of the pelvic floor. So you really want to hone in on back, front, in, and together. So it looks like this. So I'm taking my breath in, still thinking of breathing into my back ribs and let the abdominals relax on the inhale. And then on the exhale, I'm thinking, stay that length there so I'm not slouching down. And I'm thinking that back, front, in together. So that is another way you can practice connecting to your pelvic floor. Another visualization in this position is to think about as you exhale and your pelvic floor is contracting, that your perineum is lifting away from the ball. And as you're inhaling, it's relaxing down onto the ball. And of course, you can place your fingertips in between your hip bones. Slight angle forward is still important here to help feel that connection. Breathing in and back, front, in together. Now here's a side note I want you to be aware of. If you are really struggling to feel for your pelvic floor contraction and you are not noticing anything going on down there, it could mean one of a few things. It could mean one, that the muscle is just so weak that we're starting from scratch and it's going to take a little bit of time to get that connection. And if that's the case, then what I want you to do is really hone in on the visual side of it. Really make yourself believe that this is the way the body is supposed to work. And when we put that belief and positive attitude in our mind, we start to slowly be able to connect to those muscles. The second potential reason is sometimes in pregnancy and delivery particularly, there can be nerve damage that happens to the muscle. And that could make it challenging for you to feel your pelvic floor contraction. There's another case where we just have an inability to connect to our muscles, and that happens for some people. And again, that's where I'll reiterate, go to the point of where you know and believe in your body in the way that it is supposed to react and operate. Finally, it could mean you have what's called a hypertonic pelvic floor, where the pelvic floor is constantly holding tension and not relaxing. And if that's the case, then you're going to have a hard time feeling for a contraction because the muscle is already in a contract tense state. And in that case, and in all of those cases, again, it would be a good idea to see a pelvic floor physical therapist to have an assessment to see if that may be one of the issues that's going on with your body. All right, let's recap one more time. How do you know if you're doing your pelvic floor contraction correctly? As mentioned, a pelvic floor physical therapist is a great way to find out the answer. But visualization cues and tactile cues of feeling for your body and what the muscles are doing is important as well. Remember, the pelvic floor is a bowl shape. We aren't just working on contracting from the front or the back. We want to think back, front. It is multi-layers of muscle, so we want to think about in, and we want to include the transverse abdominals in that, so we want to think about wingtips coming together. That's the transverse abdominals co-contracting. So that's a good way to visualize in your head what's going on in that inner core. Remember, this is not a bicep curl, heavy loaded contraction. It's a nice gentle lift. So you want to make sure that you're not bearing down or moving your body in any way when you are doing your pelvic floor contraction, especially when you're in a lying down position. I showed you the other option of sitting as well. And finally, and again, like I said, I'll have more details on these biofeedback devices in another video. My two go-tos right now are the PeriFit and the Joy-On. They also are a way to tell you what is your strength, endurance, agility, and ability to relax your pelvic floor. And finally, if you haven't done so already, be sure to watch my video on breath and my video on posture, because they are an important part in retraining your pelvic floor and being able to set your alignment and breath up correctly so that you can start to reconnect with your pelvic floor contraction. I hope this video was helpful. Please be sure to give me a like if it was, make a comment if you have any questions or if it was helpful. Please share this video if you can, and if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.